Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the day two of webinar series, Keeping Pace with the Future of Management. Today, we are going to discuss about the topic, will you ever get a second chance? The psychology of first impressions. And today, we have our speaker, Dr. Shobana Madhavan. She is the Associate Professor from Amrita School of Business, Coimbatore. So, over to you, ma'am. Welcome to the webinar series.
Thank you so much. Namaha. Welcome to the Margadarshi series of webinars. Our topic for today is indeed a fascinating one, the importance of first impressions. We have all been told that first impressions are extremely critical judgment people make about us and the way we judge someone when we meet them for the first time. In our webinar today, we go beyond acknowledging the importance of these first impressions to actually try and understand the psychology behind these first impressions. Social psychologists have been studying the subject formally for over 8 decades now, so the subject is not new. However, we will try and introduce you to some cutting-edge research on first impressions in the webinar today. By the end of this webinar, you will pick up some tips on managing other people's impressions of you, and you will also be more aware of the errors that all of us are prone to make in our snap judgments. In short, you will have understood the science of first impressions better. So let us take a look at what we will be covering today. This is the outline of the presentation. We will first discuss why first impressions are so important. We will introduce you to 3 concepts in social psychology. They are called thin slicing, primacy effect, and the belief perseverance effect. We will then tell you how we can manage first impressions, it's called impression management, through observing visual, verbal, and vocal cues. We will also talk about how we can manage our unconscious biases, because as you will understand, first impressions can be misleading and we are often guided by stereotypes. So with greater awareness, we can actually become better decision makers and judges of people. And if any of you have any questions, we'll be glad to take them at the end. So let's begin with understanding how important first impressions are. There are many books written by general practitioners and leading social psychologists on first impressions. And why do they do that? Because much of our daily life is spent on analyzing other people and trying to understand them. This could be, for all of you prospective students, you'll be looking at interviews. Can I impress the people interviewing you? Will they form a good first impression of me? Will they recruit me? We also, in the workplace, in professional settings, we have meetings, we have negotiations, and we often meet people for the first time. And again, our first impressions might guide our future behavior with them. In social gatherings, after all of you are young, and you might go out for social events, you meet new people, and again, you will be judging them on the way they look, the way they speak, etc., the way they behave. In public spaces, this matters too. Even when we go to a theater, to a shop, again, we might bump into someone and form a positive or a negative first impression of them. So in all these cases, you can see that first impressions are everywhere in our daily lives. Every time we meet a stranger or someone for the first time, we are liable to form first impressions. Let's introduce you to a very nice term which you can use when you're speaking to your friends. It's called thin slicing. So the photograph you see here is of a leading social psychologist, Professor Nalini Ambari from Stanford University. And she and her colleague Rosenthal did a fascinating study, and they found that we all tend to make can judge people through very thin slices of behavior, meaning we can just watch someone for 30 seconds, 10 seconds, or whatever, and form a judgment. And sometimes the judgments can be very accurate. Sometimes they can be misleading. So in a classic study, she and her colleague actually looked at teacher evaluations. Students often at the end of, like in our MBA school at Amrita School of Business, at the end of every course, our students evaluate the course and the professor and our teaching. So in this case, in their study, Ambari and Rosenthal asked this question: how do college students form impressions of their professors? Is it because the quality of their teaching, etc., they wanted to know, or is it just because they judge them visually? So they did a fascinating experiment where participants, meaning students, rated random three random 10-second video clips from 12 instructors' lecture, and they even had removed the audio track. So it was just based on visual cues. You couldn't even hear the voice of the professor, but you could see the professor teaching in class. So then they asked the students to rate these videos and to rate how these professors would, how high do you think the student rating of these professors would be? The students did that. Now, this was before the students had ever been taught by these professors. At the end of the semester, they compared these evaluations with those done by actual students who had actually been taught by these 12 instructors. And they found that actually, those little 10-second video clips, we can actually judge pretty well how a professor is going to be rated by students. So this led to a lot of more studies on thin slicing and fascinating things. They looked at, this is the study, you can go to Google Scholar and look for it. They did many more studies. They looked at even the faces of chief executive officers. You're coming to a business school and CEOs, are very, they make or break a company. So, and they found that even the CEO's appearance can predict company profits. So again, they selected CEOs from the 25 very high performing and low performing companies, and then they asked again people to rate these CEOs, and again they found that actually just the appearance of the CEO could help in rating whether their company would make good profits or not, or whether it was a low performing company or not. Isn't that fascinating? Just looking at faces. There's been a lot of research. Even the politicians spend so much time on campaigns and advertising and all, but there have been many studies again in the United States saying, hey, they just showed people photographs of politicians, and then again people could actually say, hey, I can judge whether this person is going to win or not. So the person who did the study of politicians is our next scholar we're going to talk about, and he is Professor Alexander Todorov. He's written this fascinating book. It's called Face Value. The faces play a very, very important role in first impression. When we meet somebody for the first time, we're actually looking at their faces, looking at the cues we get from their faces. So he calls it the irresistible influence of first impressions, and especially the face. So again, through fascinating research techniques using digital composition of faces, he found that people form impressions even based on less than 100 milliseconds. And I'm going to show you a short YouTube video, and you will find that, you will see a lot in the video that rings true, that we actually tend to trust people who look like babies. So let's watch this video.
psychologist Alexander Todorov has discovered the mathematics underlying our first impressions. Using data he's collected from thousands of people at Princeton University, Dr. Todorov has built a computer program that can pinpoint the very parts of a face that trigger our gut instincts. That is, whether someone looks aggressive, introverted, attractive, and so on. See for yourself. As quickly as you can, answer this question. Which of these two people is more trustworthy, A or B? And what about from this pair? And this one? This probably wasn't hard, and in fact, you could have done it even faster. Here's Dr. Todorov.
You don't need more than 160 to 100 milliseconds to get pretty much the same first impression you will get from unlimited time.
This was Dr. Todorov's first finding, that first impressions are fast. The second finding is perhaps even more surprising. Almost everyone sees the same thing. Consider the faces you just saw. If you're like the majority of people in Dr. Todorov's studies, these are the ones you chose as being more trustworthy. And what about competence? Just look at this face created by Dr. Todorov's software. The changes to this face are small. The tilt of the mouth, the size of the brow, the distance between the eyes. And yet, taken together, these features trigger a judgment. If we're honest, we'll admit that this face seems to be gaining and losing IQ points right in front of our very eyes. We're all familiar with sayings like, don't judge a book by its cover. But we do. And Dr. Todorov's studies show this too.
We did some studies presenting participants' faces of politicians, and it turns out that using judgments of naive participants, we can predict about 70% of the electoral outcomes. In a nutshell, politicians who happen to look more competent than their rivals are more likely to win in the elections.
These findings, which included almost every major congressional candidate for the 2004 to 2008 elections, are incredible. Campaign promises, advertisements, and experience aside, what really matters is how you look. And faces don't just sway who we elect to lead our governments. They also affect who we hire, who we give opportunities to, who we promote. Now, if everyone sees the same thing when they look at a face, it raises the question, are these impressions accurate? Do people look more competent because they actually are more competent? Do they look more trustworthy because they are more trustworthy? The short answer is no.
Often the natural assumption is there must be some kernel of truth in these impressions. But if you look closely at the data, there's very, very little evidence that these judgments are accurate. In many situations, you can ignore completely the face and your judgment will be much better.
If faces are so misleading, the question then, of course, is why? Why do our brains do this? Here's a popular theory for the case of trustworthiness. We look more trustworthy the more we look like babies. Large eyes, small chins, round faces, these are the features we love about infants, the most trustworthy creatures there are. So when adults possess these features, we view them as more trustworthy, kind, and honest. Research tells us we're more likely to agree with baby-faced adults, to accept their offers in negotiations. We're even less likely to convict baby-faced defendants for premeditated crimes, and more likely to give them more lenient sentences when we do. And what does this mean for the workplace? Are baby-faced employees more likely to get the benefit of the doubt in a workplace dispute? Does the width of your jaw influence your hireability? Clearly, our first impressions can get us into trouble. So let's talk about how to get around them and make better decisions. It's hard. First impressions are fast and they're automatic. But if we can admit that these judgments happen, we can find simple ways to outsmart our minds. How many times have you said or heard something like this?
I felt like I could trust her as soon as I met her.
Or,
I can really see him in this role.
when you catch these moments, ask a simple question. Based on what? Want something stronger? Here's one senior leader in education's strategy. As soon as I meet someone, I acknowledge my first impression in the first 5 seconds and spend the rest of the interview trying to prove myself wrong. Be your own devil's advocate by challenging your first impressions. Finally, when applicable, try putting off the face-to-face early on in the hiring process. Focus on hard evidence of skill, talent, and experience that's in a resume or other objective forms of data as a first step. We can all be blinded by first impressions, but with regular practice, we can learn to look past the surface.
Wasn't that video just fascinating? Just looking at what social psychologists are doing in terms of even research methods, forming these composite faces, just a little shift of the setting of your eyes, the setting of your eyebrows and your mouth and your chin and your forehead, and you're just exactly the same person. And then, but the impression people form of the face is so different. You could also see how having a baby face can be a big advantage. And just like Professor Todorov mentioned, that if you have a baby face or a cute face, you're less likely to be convicted of even murder. I mean, this is not management, but when we are judging people just because they look cute and sweet, we should not think that they are going to be really good. They are not, there are many stories of many good-looking people who can also be murderers. In social psychology, they have an entire field of study, and it's called What is Beautiful is Good. As human beings, we tend to believe that if someone is very good-looking, they're also good. So we have to be aware of these biases, especially when we are recruiting people or hiring people or negotiating with people. The moment we see them, the first impression, we look at their face and say, oh, this is a good looking person and they must be good. So, but that may or may not be true. And then if you in negotiations or in a recruitment interview, just because someone is good looking and you trust them automatically because they look like a baby, then you might be in trouble if they're not. So that's why the Professor Todorov advises us strongly to be very conscious and to go beyond these first impressions, because in those first few seconds, every one of us, the moment we meet someone for the first time, the first thing is these visual cues. Even before we hear what they say or anything they're saying, we look at them. So visual cues are very, very important. And after seeing these visual cues, we start saying, hey, okay, this person looks like that, and therefore this person is trustworthy, this person is competent, this person looks very likable. Oh, this person looks like a high status person, and this person looks powerful. Because we also judge power, and in many studies they've shown, like the politicians and the CEOs, if you are judged high on dominance and maturity, again people think you're a powerful person, and all just through the way you look. So we all as human beings form a judgment which may or may not be accurate. And that's why we, as future managers, want to know more about why we can fall into traps of snap judgments which are inaccurate. So the title of this talk was, you never get a chance to make a first impression. Because we keep saying, okay, can I get a second chance to make a first impression? But research has shown that the first impression really kind of perseveres. And there are two more. We learned one term called thin slicing. There are two more concepts we'll discuss in this class. And one is called the primacy effect, and the other is belief perseverance. The primacy effect says that when it comes to forming impressions, the first traits we perceive in others influence how we view information that we learn about them later. So the very first traits we perceive is what forms our impression, and that is called the primacy effect. we'll discuss this effect in a little more detail shortly. The second concept is belief perseverance. Social psychologists have studied for a long time how we are all very, very prone to make flawed judgments. They called cognitive biases in social psychology or even in economics. So we all have this tendency to want to believe that we are right. So therefore, belief perseverance is one of those cognitive biases where we tend to stick with our initial judgment. So even if we get data saying that that judgment is incorrect, we still say, no, I'm right. I don't care what the later data says, I was right. We have this inherent desire to appear accurate, competent, and because this affects our self-esteem. So just this great desire to protect our self-esteem makes us prone to these cognitive biases. Let's look at the primacy effect. The primacy effect, there's a social psychologist called Solomon Asch. He studied this in 1946. And he looked at first impressions formally. And let me give you he did a lot of studies, and this is just one study. So he looked at how the first traits we mention also about a person stick in our heads more than the later traits we mention. So when I'm in an interview, so suppose someone asks you, hey, tell me about yourself, and they ask you in an interview, if you say you're intelligent, industrious, impulsive, and critical, they will actually first listen and hear the words intelligent and industrious, and according to Asch and many social psychologists, that's what sticks in their head to form their impression of you. Whereas if you say, if you're critical, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent, they will hear the word critical first. So if they don't like critical people, they may not want to recruit you or hire you. So when you are, in fact, we always tell our students that in their placement interviews, hey, don't even talk about negative traits. There is no need, because if this sticks in the recruiter's head, they will only hear that word. So this primacy effect is also very important when you, in interviews and all, students sometimes we have seen a tendency, they want to excuse. If there's something in their resume they're not happy with, they will say, you know what, in my 10th standard I got only 60% and all. And we just said, hey, don't begin with this. If they ask you, then tell them, stick to making a positive impression. So that is our advice. So people have found that it's better to start strong and finish weak than to start weak and finish strong, or to have a random pattern of successes and failures. So there are many studies, and not everyone will agree with this, but many social psychologists have said that everything else being equal, those who have early successes are judged to be smarter. Let's talk about the next concept, belief perseverance. So I gave you the definition before, but we shall repeat it. It is belief perseverance. Perseverance meaning it's you persevere in something. So belief perseverance is the tendency to cling to one's initial belief even after receiving new information that contradicts or discomforts the basis of that belief. We do this because of cognitive biases, and we can counter this consciously. So this has been studied in many fields, including finance. When you're invested in a company, you've invested stocks in a company, and you've invested a lot of money and in stocks in the company, and then everyone around you is saying, hey, the company is not doing well, etc. Instead of pulling out, you might tend to defend the company and say, no, I did lots of research and I consulted my fintech advisor and I was advised to invest in this company, and therefore I have faith and trust that this company is just going through a rough patch. So even if you get lots of your friends give you lots of data about the company, you still want to show that you invested these lakhs of rupees in this company. You want to show to the world that you did it. You were accurate in your assessment when you invested in the company. And so just to maintain your self-esteem, you sometimes cling to your old beliefs. And this is not just about financial stocks. It can happen about human beings. And when we judge other people also, no matter you've already decided that you're going to hire this person, and then you get other data saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't hire it, but you've already told the whole world, hey, I really like this candidate, and she was so smart in this and all that. I think she'll be a perfect fit for this role. So you can't go back on your words. That will affect your sense of being accurate and competent. So you continue defending your decision. So what happens? This has been shown. Many researchers have studied this in interviews. So, would you believe that actually if someone likes you in an interview, they actually help you. So someone is interviewing you, your first impression that you create on them is very positive. So they will make an effort that you do well in the interview. And this is from research. So even the initial greeting or in face-to-face interviews or in the virtual world, the virtual impression you create on the screen, that can guide the rest of the interview. So when you make that positive impression, the interviewers, meaning the recruiters, if it's from a company or from a college like us, we will actually, if we like you, we might give you positive, we'll talk positively about the school, we might ask you easier questions, we might gather less information, we may not even ask you very, deep. Say someone asks you a differential equation or something in an interview, you might get psyched. So we won't do that because we've decided, hey, this candidate looks good. I like this candidate and I want them in college or I want them in my company. So it has been found that because the recruiter is very warm and nice to the candidate or the applicant, so even the applicant naturally feels very confident and their communication style also improves. So this is why in certain companies they have stress interviews. So they purposely put the candidate under stress, and so this actually prevents these biases from acting up very strongly, because if you put the candidate under stress and you're not very nice to the candidate, then you overcome your biases. So you can see how the candidate, of course, responds under stress, but you also overcome your bias. So this kind of research there have been many studies on the biases that come up in interviews. So actually the personal interviews and face-to-face interviews have a low validity value. When you come and join ASB, you will actually learn about validity and reliability. They actually don't really do a very good job of finding good candidates. So it is really much safer to rely on a mix of methods such as aptitude tests and group discussion, and maybe give people a writing exercise and case studies, and also you have a mix of methods, then the bias which comes up in this personal interview can be reduced. So you should not give a very big weightage to the personal interview, again, because it tends to be swayed by biases. So initial impressions, if any of you are interested, again, go to Google Scholar, look for this article, and you'll find many more like this. So now we come to it's how do, tips to all of you. How do you manage your first impressions? Like I have mentioned through this talk, the visual cues are actually the one among the most important, because we really do go a lot by how people look and what we judge from their faces. Then of course, vocal, meaning the tone, pitch of your voice, the way you speak matters, and of course the words you say. So verbal refers to actually the words you say, and the vocal is the quality of your voice. And in this virtual world, it's much more difficult for recruiters to gauge candidates in the virtual world, because we actually get a lot of non-verbal cues when we meet people face to face, which we don't get from a virtual interview. On the other hand, for the candidate, it's really advantageous to have an online interview, because they can manage themselves and their environment much better. So all of you who are right now operating in the online world, you actually have an advantage. So it's just, for example, I said that people are swayed by looks, right? And by height. So typically they have shown, again, research has shown that if you are very tall, if a male is very tall, again, people judge them positively on leadership qualities. So if you are a tall male, the automatic bias is this person can be a good leader. So therefore, they when you have a face-to-face interview, the person can judge your height and say, oh, this person can be a good leader, and then they might recruit you. But if you don't have if you're a short person, so actually being in the online mode, if your height is below average, in the online mode, your recruiters cannot make out. So in fact, that can be an advantage, right? Similarly, people are biased against overweight people. Again, these are visual cues. So again, in the online mode, no one can make out whether you're overweight or not. So again, it's an advantage for people who have any weight problems. So being in the online mode is actually an advantage, because again, if you're overweight, again, people attributions are made that a person who's overweight is lazy, etc. This is again research. I am not giving my personal impressions. So visual cues, like I said, even weight, height, face, beauty, and all matter a lot. So let's talk about how you can manage some of these things. One is, of course, your body language. So there is a famous social psychologist, and she's done a series of TED Talks, and there are lots of YouTube videos by her, and she talks about body language and power posing. So she's done many studies to see how, if before our interviews we adopt a high power pose, we are likely to do better in the interview, and whereas if you have a low power pose, which she says, if you stand with your feet crossed and your arms are wrapped around you, then you look kind of diffident and defensive and nervous. So that doesn't help. So she has done a lot of work on these high power poses, and she's extremely popular on YouTube. So let's just take a 3-minute break and watch a 3-minute video first. You can actually watch the TED Talk when you get time. It's 20 minutes and it has more than 20 million views. But we will give you a 3-minute compressed version out here. Here we go. So this is a 3-minute compressed version. So you might notice that the voice, because they've speeded up the video, She doesn't sound like this in real life, but let's listen to her.
Offering you a free I'm going to start by offering you a free no-tech life hack, and all it requires of you is this, that you change your posture for 2 minutes. I became especially interested in nonverbal expressions of power and dominance. And what are nonverbal expressions of power and dominance? Well, so in the animal kingdom, they are about expanding. So you make yourself big, you stretch out, and humans do the same thing. So they do this both when they have power sort of chronically, and also when they're feeling powerful in the moment. So powerful people tend to be, not surprisingly, more assertive and more confident. Physiologically, there also are differences on two key hormones, testosterone, which is the dominance hormone, and cortisol, which is the stress hormone. We decided to bring people into the lab and run a little experiment. And these people adopted for 2 minutes high power poses or low power poses. And I'm just going to show you 5 of the poses, although they took on only 2. This is what happens. They come in, they spit into a vial. We, for 2 minutes, say, you need to do this or this. We then ask them, how powerful do you feel on a series of items? And then we take another saliva sample. Here's what we find on testosterone. From their baseline when they come in, high-power people experience about a 20% increase, and low-power people experience about a 10% decrease. Here's what you get on cortisol. High-power people experience about a 25% decrease, and the low-power people experience about a 15% increase. So 2 minutes lead to these hormonal changes that configure your brain to basically be either assertive, confident, and comfortable, or really stress reactive. But the next question, of course, is, can power posing for a few minutes really change your life in meaningful ways? And so what matters, where you want to use this is evaluative situations. We decided that the one that most people could relate to was the job interview. What do you do before you go into a job interview? You do this, right? You're sitting down, you're looking at your notes, you're hunching up, making yourself small, when really what you should be doing maybe is this, like in the bathroom. Okay, so we bring people into a lab and they do either high or low power poses again. They go through a very stressful job interview. It's 5 minutes long. They are being recorded. They're being judged also. We then have these coders look at these tapes, 4 of them. They're blind to the hypothesis. They're blind to the conditions. They have no idea who's been posing in what pose. They end up looking at these sets of tapes and they say, oh, we want to hire these people, all the high power posers. We don't want to hire these people. But what's driving it? It's not about the content of the speech. It's about the presence that they're bringing to the speech. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. Tiny tweaks can lead to big changes. Before you go into the next stressful evaluative situation, for 2 minutes, try doing this in the elevator, in a bathroom stall, at your desk behind closed doors. That's what you want to do. Configure your brain to cope the best in that situation. Get your testosterone up, get your cortisol down, and it can significantly change the outcomes of their life. Thank you.
Okay. So Professor Amy Curry talked about power posing. There are some controversies about the hormones and all that in her studies, but in general, people have found that your body language and the way you carry yourself does affect the way other people perceive you. So all of you, when you go for an interview, don't be sitting hunched and couched down in your chairs. To keep your shoulders back. And of course, in the Indian context, don't be too much of a power poser because people will not, there's also cultural difference. Americans really appreciate assertive people. In India, we expect, there's something called power distance when we expect students or candidates to be a little more respectful. But it will help all of you if you do a few power poses before your next stressful student, because your body and your emotions, your body, your hormones is all linked. So you can be aware of one and change the other. So you can at least feeling more powerful can be in your hands through simple things like power posing. So what other things can you all do? Visually, grooming is very, very important. We tell our students also when you go for interviews, take the trouble to cut your hair and look neat, especially because of the pandemic. The young men, no one wanted to shave, so everyone's got these beards. But if you look at CEO pictures again, you will find, especially you look at, I'm talking the United States, very few CEOs have beards and mustache. Think of all your heroes, all the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musk. No, everyone is clean shaven, and that's the standard American model of a CEO is clean shaven. So beards don't really, they're good for being, maybe if you have other professions in mind, like being a scientist or a teacher, you can be a professor with a beard and look very intellectual. But if you're going for MBA interviews or for recruitment into a top company, we would recommend that the young men among the listeners shave and adopt a clean shaven look with trimmed hair. Same for the young women in this look again. Alexander Todorov and all have done a lot of research, and they say, you have to, if you look too feminine, you're not going to be judged as competent. Then that's another cognitive bias. So for the women in this group, if you're going for a formal interview, again, don't put on too much makeup or too many dangling earrings. So look a little masculine, not too masculine, because then that also is not viewed positively. So grooming, looking clean, if it's a face-to-face interview, you should look clean, everything, all your clothes should be neat, clean, washed, pressed, and smart. So nowadays in the corporate world, in maybe even 15 years ago, the young Indian women would still go for interviews in, traditional Indian clothes, and now the Western suit has become the norm. And so, just that it's good to adopt norms to be more acceptable. So we also have found that if a candidate comes for an interview well dressed, well groomed, takes the trouble to wear formal clothes, we view them more positively. So clothes matter, grooming matters. I said accessories matter. Don't carry plastic bags and all into interviews. Even the bag you carry, the folder you carry, invest some money in some good leather folder. I have seen again people going for an interview with the plastic bag, and then they dig in and bring out all their certificates. That will definitely create a negative impression. Eye contact. In the American culture, direct eye contact is considered really important. And if you don't look into the eyes of your interviewer, they think you're dishonest. In the Indian context, Asian context in general, there are cultural differences. So you should look directly, but don't keep staring into your interviewer's eyes, because staring too much into senior people's eyes can be considered disrespectful. So you should balance. But if you're being interviewed by a Westerner in general, please do maintain eye contact. It's extremely important. They will judge you on your eye contact. Your voice also matters. It doesn't matter. You can always control the way you speak. So if you speak too fast or too slow, it's a problem. If your pitch is too high or too low, it's a problem. So try and practice before any interview, and to maintain what they'll say, madhyam, or a medium tone and a medium pitch. Another mistake we do that creates a bad impression is to use vocal fillers. And you would have seen some speakers, they'll say, maybe I can do this. Maybe. So those are called vocal fillers. So in general, try and be conscious if you use vocal fillers. In fact, ask a friend, because we are often not conscious of our own speech. So we don't know, we keep saying, maybe. So ask a friend, do speak to them, and then they might tell you, hey, you say this all the time. and then make a conscious effort to train yourself so that you stop using these vocal fillers, which can be very irritating to the listener. Sounding confident, all of us in public speaking or in an interview, we get nervous, but again, just breathing. Sometimes when you're very nervous, we forget to breathe. So if you can, when the next time you're very nervous, if you can remember just to breathe deeply once or twice, that physiological action will actually help you gain confidence. It doesn't matter if you're a little nervous. Overconfidence also is a negative. So, but it's good to sound confident and try. You can do it through practice, practice, and practice. So what are you going to say in, like, for an interview and all? Yes, so what you look like matters. And again, I'd like to emphasize that it's not everyone is born in a certain way, but you can groom yourself so that you can all look smart. So there's enough available. All our multinational companies are trying to sell us products to make us look really smart, right? So you can groom yourself. It's also your insides. If you are a happy person and feeling good about yourself, then you look good, right? So it's not just what you're born with, it's what you make of it. And so visual, vocal, verbal, the verbal thing is more under our control because we can prepare. We tell students to prepare all interviews. Typically, they warm up questions about tell me about yourself and what your strengths and weakness, all these things that if the first question is tell me about yourself and you mess up in that question and you say some foolish things about how much you have an anger problem and you failed in 10th and you didn't because your heart broke, something, you will form a very bad first impression and you probably are not going to get selected. So even that first question of typically people ask you, tell me about yourself, prepare it, write it down, make a script and practice in front of the mirror. Have a good opening, a good closing. Don't close on a weak note, don't open on a weak note. Speak about your strengths, make a positive impression. So it really, if you practice, practice and practice, that will really, really help. So we coming towards the end of our webinar today, and another thing, all this while we've been talking about impression management. I mean, how do we manage other people's impressions of us? How do we get them to form positive first impressions when they meet us for the first time? And we do this through visual, vocal, and verbal, being conscious of all these dimensions and trying to work on them. And just as I said, it's just not about what you're born with, but what you make. And it's not about conventional beauty. After all, when you think of Professor Abdul J. Kalam, it's not that he was a beautiful person, but what charisma he had. When I have seen him walk into a room full of school children, and the reception was like he's a rock star, and he was, he was dark skinned and not very tall, and he had a funny hairstyle, but because of his sheer personality, anyone who met him for the first time would be floored by him, right? So it's really not about what you're born with, but what you make of yourself. And all of you are very young, you can build your personality into a positive one. So when all of you right now, if you're young and you're students, soon you'll be managers, and then that's where you're on the other side of the table. So another thing I want you to take from this webinar is to be very conscious of your own biases, or all of us have biases, because we must realize that many of our judgments, these snap judgments which we make in seconds, they could be accurate, they could be inaccurate. So if I'm a recruiter, I need to consciously say, hey, you know what? I need to focus on what the candidate is saying. I have to look at their past academic and work experience and all those records. I have to look at their aptitude test results. I should not just be carried away by this positive first impression I have of them and then give them very high scores on the personal interview and make sure they get into my company or my business school. No, so as a recruiter, as a professor, I need to be more responsible and conscious of my judgment. And how you can do this, again, research has shown in the human resource management world that if you conduct structured interviews, you can actually control some of your biases. So if you actually have questions which are technical and all, and you go through all these questions which are related to the field of candidate, you'll be able to judge their competence much better than just asking casual questions off the top of your head. And that way you will be judging all candidates similarly if you ask them all, if through a structured interview, everyone gets judged similarly, so the evaluative criteria are the same. We also have to be very conscious of our emotions because, if someone is similar to us, we tend to like them. That's another thing in the field of social psychology. They say birds of a feather flock together. So we like people like us. We say, oh, you're from the same school, you're from the same state, you speak the same language, you look like me, therefore I like you. Whereas if you're from a different state and you don't look like me and you don't speak the same language, I may not like you. And really in this world, where there's a lot of emphasis in companies on diversity and inclusion, we need diversity and inclusion have been shown to increase creativity in teams. We need to increase the diversity in our teams and not go on hiring people who are just like us. So again, you will see when you join the corporate world, people are biased. They will tend to hire people from their own schools or similar backgrounds because we feel very comfortable with people like us. If you look at your friends, you will see, you tend to have friends who will have similar tastes and similar backgrounds. So I would again encourage all of you to, look around and understand, hey, you know what, my friends are like me, they have similar family backgrounds. Try and go beyond these first impressions of just being attracted to someone just like you and wanting to hire them, recruit them. So aversion to certain groups, again, in this biased world, there are stereotypes about certain groups. You may not like someone of a certain religion and you see them and they're wearing certain marks of their religion, and again, straight away your first impression is there is a bias and a stereotype, and really again that person might be very competent and might be just what your company needs and with just the skill. Bias towards people of a certain religion, you may not hire them, and you see that signal from whatever that first impression from what they're wearing. So let us again, in this world where we are trying to promote harmony and peace and diversity and inclusion, it's really good for all of us to be aware of all the stereotypes that we are prone to. So we can be, even people judge people unfairly on the basis of age, fitness. So like I said, as you grow older, people are less likely to want to hire you for a job, even if you're very competent. So young people are thought to be dynamic, creative, full of energy. So, when you grow to my age, and if I go for an interview, they say, okay, I'd rather hire someone, young and dynamic with, who will bring fresh thoughts to the company, right? So we can face biases in hiring on many, many criteria. So again, as future managers, we all want to be really conscious that we at least try and look at, hey, what do I really need for this role in the company? And instead of going by appearances, I look at skills and competence and maybe personality. So if you want to read more about, some fascinating research on thin slicing and all, you can also go to a very popular book, which is like a very big international bestseller by an author called Malcolm Gladwell. So he's written the entire chapter on thin slicing and a lot on recruitment biases and all. So he talks a lot about how in the United States and Germany and Europe and all, women would never be hired for these Western classical music orchestras, especially for certain instruments like the trombone, because the moment the evaluators saw a woman, they said, oh, women cannot play the trombone, women cannot play this and all, and they would never hire women. So you would see very few women in these orchestras. Then they changed their recruitment and they started having recruitment. The musician would play the instrument behind a closed curtain. So therefore, the whole bias of visual cues was gone. You could not make out whether it's a woman or a man playing. And then to their surprise, orchestras across the world found that women were really good at classical music and certain instruments which were traditionally male dominated. So many more women are being now hired into these music bands because again, when the recruiters or the raters looked and saw a young woman, they automatically got biased. This is for any kind of even music. Like I said, many of you might be music lovers. You're being judged not on the music you play, but suppose some musicians scrunch their faces in funny ways when they sing, and then again the viewer says, hey, you know what? I don't like the way this person is twisting his face or her face. I don't want him in my band. So Malcolm Gladwell has many, many fascinating examples of some of what we talked about in this seminar. So I'm come to the end of the webinar today, and I hope that we have understood a few key points. Number one, that first impressions are everywhere and every day we are making judgments of people. Number two is some of these judgments can be accurate or inaccurate, and some of these judgments are made in milliseconds. So we just judge the snap judgments, and some facial appearances and all play a very key role in these judgments, and therefore we have to be very conscious that if we are judging first, if we are hiring a model, yes, fashion model, yes, the face matters, but if we are hiring people for a certain job, or as an MBA student, we really should be saying, hey, you know what, should I be judging this person purely on their looks? So first impressions, we can manage first impressions by impression management through visual cues, vocal cues, and verbal cues. And then finally, we really have to be, all of us, to make the world a better place, a more inclusive place, a more accepting place. We need to be conscious that we can really be biased and our judgments may be flawed. So I hope this webinar has been useful in creating this awareness in you and creating and giving you a little more knowledge on the science of first impression. Thank you. Maybe we have a few questions, I'm not sure, but over to you, Rohan.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your session. It was a wonderful session for the aspirants of MBA and more. Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you all, and you can ask questions and I can answer them later. Have a good evening, and thank you, Rohan, for organizing this.
Thank you.